Good afternoon. I guess we can begin. It's a minute to 2:30, and I'm sure those who want to be here are here already. Um, this panel is entitled "It's a TV World After All," and television communities and nations. And there's a question mark after. It's a TV world after all, and there's a question mark after the conference theme as well. So we'll try and unravel that at the end. But it is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker. Each speaker has 15 minutes. Senyo, Ofori-Parku of University of Oregon. And his paper is titled "How is Television Constructing the Environmental Sanitation Problem in the South? An Analysis of TV Networks News Coverage in Ghana."
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear? It's good. All right. If there is an area of consensus from where I stand in this conference, then I think it has to do with the fact that television is changing. Whether television as a box or television on any other platform, we are kind of moving. I have a sense of consensus, and but the nature of change cannot be same everywhere. One of the things I also realized in all the discussion is the role of technology besides economics. The role technology is playing in this change or quasi change, as if you would. But in the parts of the world where we have internet penetration of about 6.2%, can we talk about the same kinds of changes? Definitely, the changes will be of different forms. So Ghana has so I'm looking at how television as a form is constructing, i.e., this has the assumption that television and mass media for that matter, does not only tell us what there is, but they always present a point of view, what they think we should see. So the question I'm posing is, how is television doing this? This paper will not look at the changes over time. Of course, there have been some changes from a time when everyone listened to was one media, from 1995 where liberalization occurred. Now there are a lot of private interests in the country. So I think that will be in another paper perhaps, how this liberalization is either how it's influencing the notion of public sphere. Is it in the issues like environment, health, etc.? How is it impacting? But for this paper, I want to briefly look at, it's purely a descriptive study. It's exploratory. So environmental issues are global. We would all agree that everywhere in the world. I've listened to the climate change debate last December in South Africa, Durban conference. There was a lot of talk about climate change, etc. So this points to the fact that climate change is, for example, it's not an issue that has to do with just one part of the world. Environmental issues they are primary to they are global issues. However, like change, the issues that affect different countries differ from place to place. For example, in the developing world, this is kind of weird, switching between places. In the developing world, we have 1 out of every 2 persons lacking basic sanitation. So this points to the fact that there are peculiar challenges in other parts of the world. And according to the Human Development Report 2000, 50% of all people in developing countries. Well, I cringe when I see such figures because I'm like, are they true? Yeah, we can question the veracity of these issues, but it points to the basic fact that there is a problem. The magnitude we may disagree, but indeed there is a problem of the sort. And in Ghana, which is my focal country, the country I want to look at, 18%, again, HDR says 18% of Ghana's population, only 18 were using improved sanitation. And their definition of sanitation does not fall within what I'm looking at. Sanitation they look at as only limited to access to toilet facilities. But I'm looking at environmental sanitation, which has to do with environmental issues of health and their relationship with health. And Ghana was ranked as the 48th country out of 52 in Africa. So in other words, it came as the mathematics says the fourth worst country in Africa, the fourth worst. And in West Africa, it only overtook Nigeria as the country, not in positively but negatively, the country with the worst condition. So clearly, there are issues of environmental sanitation in Ghana. Given the media's touted role of pointing out issues that are of importance to societies and raising them, the media's role in the public sphere, I'm therefore asking, so what is the media doing? What is the media doing? And this quote, it says, if we as a country claim to be developing, for which reason we have peculiar challenges. Why is it that when we open the newspapers, we are not talking about newspapers here, but I think this quote is striking in the sense that it points to the fact that the media may or may not be doing something right. So this person was quizzing, why is that when we flip the pages, we don't find these issues there? So I set out to explore. This served as the basis of my study, to explore which issues are there and stuff like that. What is the media doing? What are they telling people? And if we can make any suggestions for the future. And the question is, so why television? Why did I end up studying television? Why television? In a formative research preceding this, I found out that though newspapers were cited as, though radio stations were cited as the primary source of information in Ghana, television turned out to be the primary source of environmental information, and that for me was curious. So I said, then let me look at what TV was doing for people, and how come, if we can make any deductions from why television is being cited. So the question, so what is TV3 doing? And also TV3 was cited as the medium or the channel that gave them the most information, the most information. So what is TV3 doing? Within a period of 6 months, I found only 15 stories on the environment. Given the seriousness of the situation, the environmental conditions, and the rhetoric surrounding environmental issues, it's a major campaign issue for politicians and all of that. So why, how come only 15 stories were aired within a 6-month period? And this period was chosen because apparently that was supposed to be a period where the mass media, TV3, did a lot of environmental news coverage. So if within this period they actually did a lot of environmental news coverage, then let's assume that this study was carried out within another time frame, probably would have found nothing. And these were the issues highlighted. 11 of the stories looked at waste disposal and management. Apparently, that's supposed to be a suggestion regarding which issues are important, as the agenda setting theory says. And choke stories, only 3 of them. Can you go? And these were the dominant themes. They looked primarily at the causes and effects. 7 of those stories looked at that. In sanitation and development, the relationship between sanitation and how poor sanitation conditions are impacting the country. So these and the local responses, what are people doing regarding environmental sanitation? And what were the nature of the stories? Only 4 stories were detailed, and this categorization of detailed versus not detailed was based on whether these stories were based on events. Usually, in the Ghanaian media culture, I don't know if the same can be said of the United States. People are invited for press conferences, and most studies have found that the majority of the stories that are aired or covered in newspapers are mainly event-based stories. Therefore, what it suggests is that the particular voices are the ones that are heard in the media. So I found out that only 4 stories were detailed, i.e. were feature-based, were not based on events, etc. And in line with this, it's 60%, it was kind of interesting. So only 4 were detailed, but 60% of these stories were found to be journalist initiated, i.e. they were not routine stories. So this was one of the conflicting things I found in this study. One would expect that if the stories are not detailed, then what other studies, previous studies in Ghana have suggested that detailed stories are feature-based stories, and not stories that are not detailed are based on events. However, I found the contrary. So something probably was happening there. And whose voices were being heard? This was, for me, a very important issue, because I was interested in how are they being constructed around what the people think, or they are being constructed around what politicians and what the dominant voices in society think. And like Gajeko 2009 says the sources used in the story, they tell us they are indicative of which voices are driving the issues of concern. And I found that ordinary individuals were the primary drivers of environmental sanitation, if you will, let's call it agenda. Or they were they were the ones voices who were being heard in these stories. Government officials constituted 26.7%, and the others had the other share. This corroborates other findings, previous findings that were conducted in this area with regard to environmental issues, that the people's voices are likely to be heard in stories that have to do with environmental issues than other issues. And the critical question is, so if indeed this suggests that people are interested in these issues, and for that matter they are the ones who are being interviewed for these stories, then why is it that the media is still not doing enough to cover these issues? So where do we go from here? The participatory model, it suggests that the extent to which popular people, ordinary individuals, the citizenry, are given voice in the media, the more voice they are given, the likelihood of the media to set agenda or influence people's opinions, etc. So I'm suggesting that if people's voices are being heard, then there is a likelihood for the media to influence attitudes, because other studies have found that the problem with sanitation in Ghana and probably other parts of the developing world, they have to do with, they have to do with the attitudinal. So if the media would be able to cover some more, and then in the bigger framework of this study from which this paper was extrapolated, we found out that indeed there were some correlation between what the media was saying and then people were thinking. And we also ruled out the fact that they were not being influenced by the mere existence of the problem, but the media indeed was forcing that in there. So this is where I am with this study. Thank you very much.
The next paper is by Srinivas. Panthukala, English from the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. And it's entitled The Changing Face of Television as a Means of Communication in India.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, before beginning to my paper, let me give a brief introduction about me. So, sorry. Actually, I was a television journalist earlier when I worked with a regional television channel. Recently, I joined the academics as a faculty. So, this is all my experience and meeting with the professionals, academicians, and then I made an attempt to prepare this paper. My paper is about the changing face of television as a means of communication in India. This paper presents the changing face of television in India, the change in ownership, content, and viewership during 4 different time periods. Television in India first started in September 1959 in Delhi with the help of a UNESCO grant and equipment from the United States and Philips Television Company. The main purpose of television at the time was community development and education. By 1967, it expanded to include farmer education programming in the rural areas of the surrounding states. This was broadcast in a 1-hour bulletin. From 1967 to 1975, relay stations were established in several states of India. In this first phase, television in India was very limited in its reach, scope, and programming. All this changed in 1975. For the first time, an experiment in satellite television called SITE, or Satellite Instructional Television Experiment, was started in India. A NASA satellite was loaned by the United States and with the help of other infrastructure financed by the Indian government. A second phase of Indian television began. The development programs for rural students, farmers, and women, programs on science, health, family planning, national integration were beamed to 2,400 direct reception community sets that were placed in 6 poor states like Bihar, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka. Around this time, another one experiment called Kheda TV was started in the state of Gujarat. Kheda TV was viewed in 355 villages in the Kheda district in Gujarat. About 504 small 61 centimeter television sets were installed for community viewing. The main aim of this experiment was to bring development activities to the rural people. The third phase of television is marked by monopolization of state and rapid expansion of television growth. In 1975, when the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, imposed a state of national emergency, freedom of press was suppressed and broadcast media, including television, became a propaganda tool of the government. During this time, television was separated from All India Radio and given a new name called Doordarshan. Dur means distance and Darshan means vision. In 1977, when a new government came to power, an autonomous body for Indian broadcasting, the National Broadcasting Trust, was proposed. The Verghese Committee submitted a report recommending that All India Radio and Doordarshan should function under National Broadcasting Trust as an autonomous body. It also suggested the setup of complaint board with quasi-judicial body. In 1979 to 80, Indira Gandhi's Congress government returned to power and shelved the Verghese Committee report. Until now, these recommendations have not been implemented, and state-run television functions under Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. Under the Congress government, the broadcasting infrastructure in India expanded rapidly in the 1980s, catalyzed by the impending Asian Games in New Delhi. This expansion was done under the supervision of Indira Gandhi's son, Rajiv Gandhi, who was just establishing himself as a young and dynamic leader of modern India. India's 18 television transmitters in 1979 expanded to 176 by 1985. With this, 80% of urban population, 50% of rural population came within the range of television, the signals or penetration. For the first time, the color TV was introduced. Thus, the form and content of television in India has changed dramatically. Soap operas, news, current affairs, and advertisements began to appear on television. The popular epic serials like Ramayana and Mahabharata were telecast during this time. The fourth phase of television began with liberalization. After 1990s, with liberalization, economic reforms, and globalization, the monopoly of state-owned television disappeared. There was mushrooming of private television channels all over India. The ownership, the form, and content of television underwent a dramatic change. Between 2000 to 2011, in one decade, a total around 800 news and non-news television channels were registered all over the country, and 150 are in the waiting list. Of these, today, about 200 news channels actively broadcast news in English, Hindi, and 10 to 12 other regional languages. From 2009 to 2011, television owning households increased from 123 million to 141 millions, and the cable and satellite television households increased from 90 millions to 116 million households. The direct to home television sets increased from 15 millions to 26 million people who own television sets. This is according to TAM India 2010 report. So, what is the face of television in India today? Today, in India, the number of television channels has grown exponentially. The ownership or monopoly of state-run television has transferred from the state to the private sphere. The content of television has diversified. Ad revenue and viewership has increased tremendously. However, the focus of television in India today is on urban, middle class, and educated audience. Rural programming is no longer a focus. Entertainment has overtaken the development and education programs. The line between news and entertainment have blurred into infotainment, 24 hours news channels especially. With the advent of privatization, the ownership of television in India is now in the hands of businessmen, political leaders, realtors, and journalists turned owners and others who are investing in the television industry to promote their own interest. Television became a propaganda tool for different political and economic interests in the country. Several national and regional parties using TV as a political communication, especially in southern India, with channels like Sun Network that did propaganda for DMK party, Jaya Television for AIDMK party, and ETV Network, which is supporting Telugu Desam party in Andhra Pradesh and other, the Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and so on. So media, which should have been the pillar and watchdog for democracy, became a pet dog for political and market interest. So today, even though there is no longer state control on television and there seems to be a plurality in the face of television, it is still serving the dominant political interest, while the interest of urban and rural poor, Dalit, tribal, and women are being ignored. The interests of these sections can be served only when ownership and production of television moves into their hands in the form of community television. Though there are many challenges for community broadcasting, it is a goal worth pursuing. Thank you for the opportunity.
The next speaker is Graeme Turner from University of Queensland in Australia. His paper is entitled The Persistence of Television, Sharedness, Liveness, and the Construction of Communities.
Thank you. This is actually from a chapter from a book that I'm writing with the colleague Anna Pertiera, and it's a long chapter, so really it's not so much a paper as a trailer. I'm going to give you, the setup and the conclusion and a little bit in between. And it comes after a chapter which is devoted to looking at the relationship between television and the nation. And so this chapter is actually looking at the way in which television plays a role in constructing communities. That really doesn't fit into that model of broadcast television and the nation. And part of the setup is just to say that many have argued that we're witnessing the emergence of new kinds of media-generated communities, and that much of the industry and academic discussion of the changing formats of television and online media have focused on the differences proposed between new forms of community enabled by the multi-channel and online environments, and they are virtual, transnational, vernacular, and customised to the consumer's preferences, and those more familiar and traditional communities constructed by a national broadcaster, which are national, geopolitically located, often institutionalised and certainly centralised. And typically and crucially, these new communities locate themselves in a media rather than a geopolitical space. Okay, that's the problem that I wanted to talk about. Now, there are important differences as well as important similarities between the capacities or affordances of broadcast and digital media. But our chapter suggests that it's by no means clear that they have led to the development of new forms of community. The fact that this is so frequently the claim probably reflects the relatively undisciplined manner in which the term community is often used in media and cultural studies. Sometimes it's in effect offered as a form of analogy, suggesting that what is being described works a bit like a community rather than arguing that it really is a community, in order to emphasise particular aspects of its proposed function. Even though media and cultural studies in general, and television studies in particular, have spent very little time developing or theorising the idea of community, and the comparison with this field of debate with that of the social sciences, for instance, is quite revealing. They share the common assumption that community is a good thing. Consequently, there is every reason to embrace an association with it. So you've got Raymond Williams in Keywords describing the situation this way, and I quote, "Community can be the warmly persuasive word to describe an existing set of relationships, or the warmly persuasive word to describe an alternative set of relationships." You don't often think of Raymond Williams as having a sense of humour. This is the one occasion I think I've found it. What is most important, perhaps, is that unlike other terms of social organisation, like state, nation, society, etc., it never seems to be used unfavourably and never to be given any positive, opposing or distinguishing term, unquote. Now, in the context we're describing here, community is put to work as a means of advancing the claims for grassroots democratic empowerment that are so frequently connected to analyses of the politics of new media forms. In precisely the manner that Williams suggests, community is used as a means of recommending an alternative set of relationships in which the power of the consumer to control their media consumption and to a lesser degree to produce their own media content is held to have been dramatically enhanced by the shift to digital technologies and the expansion of choice that comes with the multi-channel environment for television. Community is an important component in the more optimistic readings of the political potential of the new media landscape, so that if the new media creates new kinds of community, it seems then that they are clearly pro-social technologies. Whatever other commercial or political objectives they might pursue can in effect be overlooked. More to the point, these new communities exhibit particular characteristics that allow them to be regarded as a preferred alternative to top-down, institutionally driven communities such as those of the state or the nation. And what happens next, I go on quite a long discussion of the idea of community, to give a bit of a history of the way in which it's been used outside cultural studies, certainly, because it hasn't been used very well there. And then what I do is say, all right, let's look at the things that are traditionally seen as fundamental to the way in which television helps to construct communities, and compare compare the performance of broadcast, subscription, and online against those categories. And so there's nothing new about the categories. That one is sharedness, Daniel Diane's notion of the way in which consumption occurs in common with other people, and it brings in Ellis's notion of there being a co-present national audience. We use the notion of liveness, and we extend liveness to mean not just something that happens now, but as a discursive feature, the way in which, like a magazine host on a television show might talk to the audience as if they're present and saying, we are thinking about that, and where we're taking you to now, those kind of discursive attributes of television's mode of address. The notion of everydayness, the way in which the patterning of schedules is embedded into everyday life in particular ways, and that's it, I think. And so what we do is set up a comparison of these media forms to try and work out just how substantial is the evidence for new kinds of community being constructed through. I mean, really through the major issue is to look at subscription television or cable or satellite TV and online platforms for the delivery of television as against broadcast. As I said, we've talked about the way in which broadcast produces that sense of community and its relationship to the nation in the preceding chapter, and I do talk about that partly in this chapter as well. But the two real foci of the argument are the multi-channel environment produced by subscription and online environments produced by a whole range of other affordances. And so what I'm going to read you now is really just the concluding couple of pages where I tell you what we think. Okay. So while we recognise the benefit that the multi-channel brings in terms of choice and customisation and so on, the shift to a multi-channel environment, in our view, does create a deficit in the area of community. There are residual formations that possess some of the attributes of a community: fans, multi-platform, sometimes interactive engagement with particular programs, for instance. But the key target of subscription television is the individual, and they are reached through their personal tastes and interests. The construction of a community, when it occurs, is at best an accidental byproduct of a range of promotional or marketing strategies aimed at maximising the consumer's engagement with their television choice. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course. HBO's success with high-profile long-form drama has generated an extensive public through its DVD distribution as well as through its initial transmission. And there are examples from reality television as well, although some of them, you've got to wonder at. I mean, one of the examples of a kind of pro-social function for reality TV is the dispute between Jade Goody and Shilpa Shetty in the UK's Celebrity Big Brother. I think maybe there are other ways to have discussions about race than having people abusing each other in the Big Brother house. But nonetheless, it certainly did generate a national conversation that seems ultimately to have been resolved in the right way. Although if you follow the history of Jade Goody right through to her death, it becomes extremely complicated. She becomes a much loved person at the point when she dies, which I guess better late than never. In general, however, any claims for subscription television's substantial participation in the construction of communities can only be supported if we adopt a diluted and reduced sense of what we understand by community. And what I'd said earlier in the chapter is really arguing about what that diluted and reduced sense of community might be. That I'll come back to that. I guess that it does. It's partly about patterns of obligation and responsibility as well as simply talking to each other. Now, we would not make the same argument in relation to the still developing online platforms for television. As we've said earlier in this chapter, some of the core attributes which shape television's participation in the constructing of community, sharedness, liveness, immediacy, are also core components for much of what happens online. There are clear parallels for the fabled water cooler conversations. The capacity to share favourite content is dramatically enhanced in the digital environment generally, but this is particularly the case online. And real-time interaction is one of the fundamental capacities provided online. We see much stronger evidence in this context for the proposition that the new platforms of delivery have found new ways to construct community. That said, it's also the case that the communities in question are quite tightly focused. For instance, they might be de facto personal networks, or they might be concentrated almost exclusively on media consumption. Also, there seems to be little in the way of a framework of community-driven rights and responsibilities aimed at serving the common good rather than personal interests. There are protocols of online behaviour which the participants collectively observe, of course, but this stops well short of the extensive patterns of obligations we noted at the beginning of this section of the chapter as structuring the practices of everyday life. So although something interesting and new is clearly happening, it's debatable if that is in fact and at this point properly described as a community. Rheingold's recanting of his virtual communities label seems apposite here. Earlier in the chapter we mentioned Rheingold's book, The Virtual Community, which was where that phrase was coined, and his that was 93 that came out, and his 2000 revised edition of actually says, if I'd known more about social anthropology and social networks, I wouldn't have used that term because it's got me into trouble ever since, and which saved us all a decade of debate. And I would have called it, I wouldn't have called them communities. I would have called them networks. So that would have done a lot of people out of their living. So his recanting of that label seems apposite here. It's easy to accept that the new platforms for television have enabled its enclosure within what clearly are new ways of building social networks, but it's harder to accept that these amount to new kinds of community without, once again, accepting a dilution of the idea of community itself. In conclusion, then, our view is that although we are comfortable with thinking of the nation as an imagined community, and that's what we talk about in the previous chapter, we should be more circumspect about accepting the idea that what is constructed around, for instance, an online fans discussion site similarly constitutes a community. We have seen that there are important continuities between the functions of these two locations, but there are also significant differences. The mass-mediated national community is externally structured, but it has the potential to affect all aspects of one's daily life, even if it only sporadically enters one's consciousness, and even if each of us has reservations about how thoroughly we seek to belong. As a community, the nation is managed by extensive lines of association, entitlement and obligation, but they vary significantly in intensity and between individual subjects. The typical online fan community, on the other hand, is marked by strong lines of affinity, organised around shared tastes and knowledges, but for most of those who belong to such a community, its implication into the full range of practices of everyday life will be limited. The specific connections between members may be stronger, more focused, and perhaps even more in the foreground of their everyday lives, but their sphere of activities will be more narrow than those constructed via national institutions. As we used to say about broadcast television audiences, we are only fans of our favourite program for a very small part of our daily lives. There is evidence that new media have helped us to find new ways to build social networks. We don't think there is strong evidence yet that they have helped us to find new ways to build communities. Even if we define community as a form of consciousness rather than as a physical space, the model of the online community still involves a relatively narrow range of activity and a limited set of responsibilities and obligations. What is mostly shared among their members, and sharing is the key activity in the construction of community, is either content itself or recommendations about or responses to media content. As a result of digital media's provision of interactivity, the proliferation of choices and the varying playlists of preferences with which we can now interact, the niches into which we can now direct consumption have become more densely populated and far noisier. However, rather than describing these niches as communities, we think it is more useful to describe them as zones of consumption. There are locations that possess certain capabilities, sharing and networking, for instance, some of which have the capacity to work like mechanisms of community. But in the end, the television channel or the online video aggregator is a location for the performance of consumption, and a location that is complexly and individually framed. As is the case more generally in our use of that term, the term zone of consumption is something we develop throughout the book. The adoption of this label avoids a loose appropriation of some of the long-standing assumptions associated with community, while usefully ensuring an emphasis on examining more thoroughly where consumption occurs and how that location is actually framed by its own specific determinants, such as patterns of cultural affinity, industrial and regulatory structures, as well as the particulars of space and place. That kind of examination does seem to be necessary before we rush too readily into attaching the label of community onto an emerging media formation. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Geoff Lealand from University of Waikoto. And his paper is entitled History as a Game Show, New Zealand Celebrates 50 Years of Television.
We are a bit of a grab bag with the rest of the world in the session. I would begin, I guess one thing I should ask, see if you can tell a regional difference between Graeme's accent and mine. We are close, we are not the same. I actually went to Powell's bookshop the other day and put in the search word New Zealand, and all the Australian references popped up. This must be changed, this is not right. But I will begin in something that's very particular to New Zealand, a greeting in Maori, which is one of our official languages. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome, welcome to you all. If I was in New Zealand, my custom would be a much longer greeting, a mihi in Maori, explain who I am and where I come from, what is my river, what is my mountain, what is my origin. But you will tend to be spared that. But it's a norm for a New Zealand academic to do that at a conference. I'm going to, if I can get this, talk about the recent history of television, a recent past. I take my cue these days when I talk about television from John Ellis, the British scholars, guiding words that it's about the impossibility of generalising about television these days. So I'm only talking about some television I know about, television in the small South Pacific nation of New Zealand. I don't have so much to say about American television. As I said yesterday, I re-encounter American television again as foreign television, and I gaze upon it with wonder and perhaps a little horror at times too. So I'm talking about my experience and my So I'm talking about the recent past of television in New Zealand, where in 2010 we celebrated, and there's a reason why it's in quotes, we celebrated 50 years of television in our country. And it's based on a book chapter which is finished in print and should be out sometime later this year. A book put together by two Australian scholars about remembering television. So I'm just going to take quickly through a very short history of television in New Zealand and its strange quirks and its peculiar ways of doing things. So we were kind of late in New Zealand in terms of an affluent and English-speaking country, primarily English-speaking country, in acquiring television sort of like a decade after Britain and the USA. And from the beginning, we had a mixed system, and that's been both the source of the way in which television was developed and also the lingering source of some of our problems that still are with us. So television has been shaped by government policy all the way along, by successive governments who, as soon as a new Minister of Broadcasting is introduced to us, he'll go and change the shape of television with a degree of certainty. Often referred to as a political football. Television gets kicked around every election. So we've got a mix of commercial and non-commercial, and we've got some things that are, again, very particular to the country. Two channels, for example, which their primary role is to promote Te Reo Māori, the Maori language. State-funded, two channels. But as with the SBS in Australia, majority viewership for Maori channels is not Maori, it's Pākehā New Zealand like myself. They go to something different. We're now in yet another government, a kind of conservative coalition. They again looking to change television. And so we've got these peculiar things, really strange economics. We give television a chunk of money, and we still continue to do. State broadcaster gets a chunk of money from the government to meet public service broadcasting obligations. At the same time, it has to return money back to the government from television advertising, from revenue. Take with one hand, give one hand, take it away with the other. But now the onus is on Television New Zealand, the two state-owned dominant channels, to increase their revenue, to increase their dividend, to make more money. So that means that the public service broadcasting elements are diminishing daily. In New Zealand, for a small population, 4.2 million, that's fairly tiny, we've got a hell of a lot of television. We've got some residual public service broadcasting. We've got, again, an element which I think is quite unique, and we do have regular visitors from other systems looking at the agency, New Zealand On Air agency, for example, which is given a chunk of government money every year to fund non-commercial television programming. They basically are television commissioners. You go to them and you put together a proposal. I've got one with them at the moment, but it's incidental. They will give you money to make that program. With no other obligation other than you have to have a slot on one of the channels for them to screen it. We have Freeview, like UK, which all you do is buy a set-top box, and from thence on you get free, commercial-free channels. And one of the most important ones is TVNZ7, which screens media commentary programs, for example, which I really like. But the funding for that expires in June of this year, and there's still a great degree of uncertainty what's going to happen, whether it's going to die or actually going to be continued. And again, as I suggested, we've got the Maori television service, which has a very cultural brief. But it's a brief that's not been invented, it's a brief that is embedded in the history of the country. The Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, the agreement between the British Crown and Maori tribes that resources must be shared. So the resources include broadcasting, television, radio. So that is funded by the state to promote, preserve Te Reo Māori. But then we've got this other major player, primarily overseas owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, which runs rampant. It is unregulated, it is monopolistic, and it is a source of great grief for scholars like myself, that it has the ability to intrude in New Zealand households without any obligations in terms of local content. It has siphoned off the major sports in New Zealand, the best sports in the world, netball and rugby. New Zealand, just incidentally, is the world rugby champion, but it's by the by. But when it looked like Sky was going to have exclusive rights to rugby, that there was a general, that's one reason New Zealanders will get a bit of a raise and take to the streets when they can't get to watch rugby. And when it looked like Sky was going to have exclusive rights to rugby, particularly Rugby World Cup, there was great public unrest, and they had to backpack and make that programming available elsewhere. But in terms of their general day-to-day monopoly of pay TV, it's less troublesome, I think, for most New Zealanders. So, where's this all leading to me? Well, as I say, June 2010, New Zealand faced an interesting anniversary, 50 years of television from June 1960, 50 years of television. What did it mean? What did it mean for New Zealand in terms of a moment to celebrate? Well, how did TVNZ celebrate it? What they did, they set up a game show with local celebrities, asking questions, most of them they couldn't answer, and the sponsorship prize. That's how they celebrated it. That was greeted with general dismay by most people, saying, "Hell, this is the 50th of television, this is how you're going to celebrate it." As against, curiously, and this is a one sort of examples of critical response to that event. I've actually got excerpts of this particular program on the DVD, but it's probably not time to show it. I particularly like that commenting, it's kind of like a retirement, given a kind of cheap watch, and this is 50 years, how you celebrate it. Or with chips and a litre of orange juice. I've been to those kind of celebrations. On the other hand, what we had was much more substantial, a 7-part documentary series paid for, funded by New Zealand Air, for an independent production company, but screened on a channel owned by the pay TV provider. Now that's another interesting quirk. We've got a free-to-air channel owned by Sky Networks. Why do they own it? What's it means of cross-promotion? So they can put rugby both on pay TV and on free-to-air TV. So, and they were a small channel. They were not the dominant major channels, TVNZ 1 and 2. It was on Prime, which generally attracts around about 5% of viewing audience. So a very kind of disappointing celebration for me. So that's some comments about that particular documentary series. It was a very good series. It was a series that looked at not just programs, but also the social and cultural impact. The role of television, for example, in promoting Maori language or a sense of biculturalism or multiculturalism in New Zealand. So this was a very poor celebration for me, and I felt, well, I've got to do my bit as someone who writes about television and motes about it all the time. I had to intervene some way, so I set up a website. Because what seemed in the celebration, there was a documentary, there's a game show, but there wasn't really a voice for the viewer to actually share their memories. People who had watched television over 50 years, they kind of remember the important moments and to kind of reflect on what it meant in their own lives. So I set up this website, which is still up on the web, allowing people to record memories and have a conversation about television. There's so much out there on the web in terms of clutter. How the hell do you promote this? I got lots of unsolicited promotion. People who had actually found to say, do go and look at the site. I didn't go really actively market it. I regard it as a modest success. But modesty aside, it did attract a lot more traffic in a much grander and a much more ambitious Australian site, which, by all accounts, attracted nil response.
Pretty much, yeah.
Pretty much. So, that's not really what I should compare it with, but basically, this is a one-man band, and I was trying to offer an opportunity for viewers. That's what it looks like. If you go on the web, it's still there, and you can look at some of the commentaries and conversations. One thing I did do to it was get my students, who I always get them at the start of my second year television course, to write their own media histories. Instead of just doing it as a assignment for me, I got them to post it on this website. What it enabled to do was actually broaden the demographic and the language, because most of the postings tend to be from older viewers. You could kind of discern that. It also was an interesting thing because most students are really reluctant to actually go to blogs, particularly to contribute to them, and they have to be gently persuaded that they're an important source of dialogue or sharing ideas. So just some final thoughts, and a lot of the thoughts and the speculations I read in the book chapter rather than this presentation. I sort of had to think through, why was this celebration, to me, very much a failure in terms of acknowledging the importance of those 50 years of television. I think partly it's because of the internal tensions in New Zealand television structures, the continuing tension between public service objectives and commercial imperatives. I also see that as a reflection in a way of diminished role and importance, and perhaps diminished respect for television amongst the New Zealand population, and partly that is attributed to the kind of things that TVNZ does these days, put on a game show to celebrate 50 years of television. But it's also perhaps a symptom of public service broadcasting in the reversible retreat, that it is not, we don't have those dialogues amongst ourselves so much in New Zealand anymore, except amongst a kind of a small group of academics and viewers who really, really care about these things. But that maybe maybe there's more than that. At the moment there's a Save TVNZ campaign going on Facebook, and it's actually generating quite a lot of traffic. So maybe it's not just me, maybe there's a lot of people out there really prompted may actually care about these things. But just to finish, a couple words from two of my students who posted on this website. If I have some disappointments about this celebration, these students are a source of reassurance to me. But they really, these are 17, 18-year-olds are not supposed to care about television. There are ones who are supposed to be on the web all the time now, but they, in their unsolicited and free and open responses, they've heartened me a little at the end of the exercise. So that's where I finish.
We have about half an hour for the question and answers to our panelists.
I just have a quick question for, and excuse me if you said this and I missed it because it's late in the day and my attention is getting spotty, but I think you said that 25% of viewers watch the Sky channels. What are the comparable viewing percentages for the other channels?
Oh, well, TV1 and TV2, the TVNZ channels still dominate. They are around 60% of viewing, yeah. So despite the fact that they don't satisfy everyone, they're still dominant in the market. And they're the ones that generate the most money, and the most money for the government too. This is an earlier manifestation of television. New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation. Well, people think it is. They say it's a really old T-shirt. It should date from the 1960s, but actually it's New Zealand Bloggers Club. That's a form of co-option I kind of like. Yeah.
This is for Graeme also. I have a class that I do on media of the 50s, and I send my students off to do oral histories with grandparents and whoever they can find who can talk about their experiences of media in the 50s. And what we get back are these wonderful histories that really also connect with the community topic, that they talk about the first television in their neighborhood and how everybody would gather at that house and so on. And it's just wonderful little vignettes of time that are a nice way of helping students get into that far away time, and also starting to record some very informal history that doesn't get into the books.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest problems I had with public service television is not the service of the television, is who is the public these days. We should be talking about publics. We use the phrase so freely that we don't actually reflect on it enough, I think. What are the communities that constitute the public these days?
Yeah, the site that Geoff was referring to that attracted no interest, which is the Australian one, came out of a project that was like what you're talking about, which was an attempt to write a history of Australian television through people's memories, rather than institutional history or history of programs. It was oral history, and they didn't get no response, but limited response. And one of the reasons, I think, is where it was located. It was in an institutional space rather than the public space. So I think that was off-putting. And so one of the things we did was start to contact people who'd worked in television, and it turned out there's a group called TV Pioneers, who are the people who started producing locally produced television in Australia in the 50s. And they, being in the communication industry, they're acutely aware that they're dying out, and that their knowledge and their experiences are lost. And so they're starting to record those experiences and keep a record of themselves. But also, as part of this project, we actually started to do some interviews where we just spent a bit of time talking to these people about what they did and how they did it and how it felt and so on. So it's kind of an urgent project, you know, that because their view of what television had a kind of national mission behind them. It's a very, very different formation, I think. But they saw themselves as modernising the country, as providing a source of information that was intrinsically valuable and democratising and informative. And the idea that they were just making entertainment, which is kind of what you would have now from their younger counterparts, didn't come up at all. So their sense of concern that their knowledges are dying are also a concern about a particular formation of television, having already died, but the memory of that being endangered too.
Yeah, I must say, I mean, I don't take any pleasure out of the fact that TV Land didn't get the response it should, because it was a very, very good site, and I wondered why it didn't get a better response.
Why it went wrong.
But I also, as part of my research, also talked to a great range of program makers, policy makers, schedulers too, about how they perceived those 50 years of television.
This is a question about Indian television. It's my impression, particularly from a piece in popular culture in globalized India, that the transition to local languages and to multiple channels had pretty radical effects on Indian politics of really opening up the system. That Doordarshan as well, despite its public service orientation, was very, very narrow in the kind of people that it applied to, that it aimed at. Is this an accurate impression?
Yeah, you are right. Is the Doordarshan, the state-owned media, is coming narrow. Because except they're getting the free space in the cable network, the most of the people, regional channels, any regional channel you take, Telugu, Tamil, Malayalam, and Bengali, those channels are, it's like booming. It's a good market and good audience and the debate. But only thing is the space of the private television channels of development issues very less. So it is a complete agenda setting, the soundbite journalism. So whatever, it's like a sensationalism. The inviting the people and the passing the time and these things. So Doordarshan, it is not like that. Doordarshan has to focus the development issues, Dalit issues, tribal issues, women issues, because Doordarshan is state-owned media, so it has a limitation. So it has to continue that. So that limitation is there. But private television channels, regional television channels, there is no limitation. Whatever they want, they can do the stories. So information has become infotainment. Everything is infotainment. The wedding ceremony, that will be one day show. The one celebrity is getting wedding, then 1 week show. So no limit or nobody can say, why are you, the audience are not interesting, but they say audience are very much interested to watch celebrities' marriages or whatever. These are the differences are there, the Doordarshan and the private television channels.
Just a question about TV in Ghana. Is it still watch community in many cases? You know, not as a kind of village group, or is it still primarily domestic now?
Television in Ghana, it's quite widespread, right, by and large, but there are still restrictions in terms of so the only restrictions have to do with infrastructure.
Right.
So it's everywhere in theory, but not everyone has it because of, for example, access to electricity and access to the means to own the sets.
Right.
Thank you. Also, a question about Ghana and community. Two things. The first is, what do you reflect on the reasons why television is actually taking up the theme about environment and community and not the other media? The other thing is also related to community in terms of how people actually watch television in places where there's no electricity. In Mexico, there's some instances, although we have a huge coverage of electricity power across the country, there's some places that we don't have electricity, and people use car batteries to power the TV sets, and it's a sort of communal viewership. Various families come together to a single house to watch different programs. Is that also happening there?
Your second question first. I think that's predominantly the phenomenon. It's a developing country phenomenon. In Ghana, in rural Ghana, you find out that car batteries, I mean, it's a very similar picture. And though you might have bought your TV, it's not yours. It belongs to the man next door. It belongs to the other door, the other people. I mean, it's a community thing. So that's how people manage to watch TV. But the other thing with rural television is not everyone. Currently, there are between about 11 free-to-air television stations. However, they are mainly urban. So the state television is what is more widespread. For the other station, economic interest drive these things. Though it sounds reductionist, I think that's predominantly it. And so their definition of being widespread extends only to the other regions, the capital regions of the capital regions. So they claim they are nationwide, but they are only in the capital towns. So that is it. And your first question, I think it's a very interesting thing. I can't get my hands around it fully, but based on my experience and looking at the social milieu and all the factors that are at play, I would think, one, the power of the medium itself could be a factor why. It doesn't necessarily mean that this study does not show the newspapers were not covering the environment. It could be, and previous studies have suggested. Initially, I set out to look at newspaper coverage because that they are the ones who give coverage to some of these issues, and then the television stations would discuss them and stuff like that. So I wanted to, but I said, let me see what the people are watching, and that was like a moment of awakening for me that people are actually. So it doesn't in any way mean that TV is covering, as the figures show, within a 6-month period, for such an issue of looking at the importance of the issue and how serious it is, one would expect to find more than we found. So it doesn't in any way suggest that TV is doing a great job.
Also, in terms of public system television, New Zealand and Australia, have you seen instances? I find it quite striking, the fact that you actually had a celebration of the 50 years of television. We didn't have
Australia, but 2 years.
Well, we didn't have any,
yeah,
and
right.
it should be as important. But I was wondering about the public television systems and whether you see instances where TV viewers are somehow appropriating, or they are sort of identifying as co-owners of the public service in terms of what you were questioning in terms of the publics and the communities. I mean, is this, have you seen this sort of participation within the public system, broadcasting systems?
Well, they use the language of communities, the channels themselves. Our television the nation's television. Whether that's an illusion or not, I think there's probably communities around locally made children's television. There certainly is a community around the Freeview non-commercial channels, and that's whether suddenly there is this campaign, Save That Channel. It really hasn't. I doubt very much if there'd be a similar campaign to save the two major channels. There's a campaign around to protect non-commercial radio, but somehow I don't see the same sort of upswelling public kind of interest in protecting those two major channels. In some ways, they've lost the respect, I think, of the audience. You know.
Why?
Because of this tension they've had to where commercial imperative has become paramount. And now their funding, which used to be kind of half and half government funding and commercials, it's now 90%. 90% of the revenue comes from advertising. So that's really pushed them in a direction that a lot of people don't like.
Yeah, it's quite different in Australia because the main public broadcasting channel has resisted commercialisation, and they don't take commercials, and that's been, that's been a battle, a continual battle, because government would like them to do that, because government thinks that would reduce the amount of money they would have to give them. But there's an organisation called Friends of the ABC, Friends of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and every time you have a lecture or a seminar on the ABC, they turn up in their droves, and they ask questions about funding and policy and so on. So there's actually quite a strong group. I mean, it's a middle class, high. The age demographic is old, etc. You can imagine, but nonetheless, it's active, and at points when there have been government inquiries into the ABC, and that happens with some regularity, usually because they want to set up an inquiry to work out a way they can cut their funding. When they happen, the public responds pretty strongly. So at the last instance, I can recall, it was quite a while ago now, maybe 10 years or so ago, when it was widely rumoured that the point of the inquiry was to cut the amount of news and current affairs that the ABC did, and the argument was that the commercial channels were now doing more of that, and that it was now there were now cable channels that were 24 hours, etc. So the provision of news wasn't a problem, and therefore, the ABC cut news and current affairs out of the ABC. Well, I mean, I was partly involved in doing research for the ABC that was aimed at disproving that case. So I had a stake in it. But what was interesting was when they called for submissions from the public, they got 11,000 submissions from members of the public. These weren't from just academics and people within 11,000 submissions. Written cases defending particular aspects of what it was that the ABC did, and arguing against proposals to cut their funding. So, I mean, that the ABC has it's a kind of old fogey image in lots of ways, but it still remains the place where people go when there's emergency of any kind. They'll go to coverage there. They'll go to their political coverage at times of crisis and so on. So it's still got a level of trust, and it's got a level of reliability in terms of just whether you trust them to be truthful, that the commercial channels don't have. And they're not seen as being a service that will sensationalise news, for instance. And so, I mean, on the one hand, they're a bit like, your favourite aunt, but on the other hand, they're seen as being, an important part of the provision of information for the state. And so it's unimaginable that the ABC would be forced to take advertising and not have a major furore about that being done.
Our problem is we've got a government which is not really so much hostile to public service broadcasting as indifferent to it, and that's another problem, really.
Yeah, I mean that's always the problem. That one of the phrases about public broadcasting by an Australian Prime Minister was, "The ABC is our enemies talking to our friends," and so you want to stop that happening, you know. So they weren't indifferent, but it was simply too difficult to do.
About nearing time.
Thanks. This is a question for Geoff. If you could reflect on the moment in the mid-1980s when journalists and regulators from all over the world in the media area flocked to New Zealand to interview one of the great criminals of the 20th century, Roger Douglas.
Yes.
Why that happened, and whether New Zealand still has that kind of massive global public policy stature. What do you think of it looking back?
He's now Sir Roger Douglas. And he got back into Parliament on the tails of a kind of small right-wing party, which has now got one member. He's retired and everyone breathed a sigh of relief, really. But he did a hell of a lot of damage in this time. And not just New Zealand, but also around the world. This kind of deregulation zeal. He should really be held accountable, and I really think he should be jailed in his dotage.
Thank you to the audience.